and welcome to our joint launch. I'm Deirdre O'Byrne of Five Leaves Bookshop. And tonight we've got a joint launch, Venetia Welby launching Dreamtime and Alison Moore launching The Retreat. So how it'll work is I will introduce Alison, I'll tell you a bit about her, and then she will read from her book. And then I'll introduce Venetia and she'll read and talk a bit about her book. The housekeeping, you can of course buy the book from Five Leaves, and Simon will put the link in the chat. You can join in the chat, but we won't be keeping an eye on that. If you have questions for the authors, and there will be questions at the end, if you've got questions for the authors, please put them in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I won't see them. And so get your questions ready for the end. I'll have a discussion. We'll have a three-way discussion between the three of us, and then I will go to the Q&A. So, Alison Moore, I'm going to start by introducing you a bit, but you'll of course tell us a lot more about your own book tonight. Your short stories have been published in various magazines, journals, and anthologies. Best British Short Stories, Best British Horror, and so on, broadcast on BBC Radio. And you won the New Writer Novella Prize. The Lighthouse was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, National Book Awards, and it won the McKittrick Prize. And you've recently moved into writing for children. So can you tell us something about your novel, The Retreat, that's just out?
Okay, thank you, Deirdre. So The Retreat is about a woman in her 40s called Sandra Peters, who dreamed of going to art college but never did. She works as a receptionist but still tinkers with art in her spare time, goes to evening classes, takes part in a drop-in artists group on holiday, and is generally holding on to that lifelong fantasy of being an artist. As a child, she saw a distant island that intrigued her. I'm going to read the first few pages of the prologue, in which Sandra, holidaying on the island of Lieloh, sees the smaller island of Lieloh for the first time. Lieloh was an in-between place. Lying 100 miles from the English coast, the island resembled Sandra's known world, but it had its own currency and its own system of car number plates. Its post boxes were blue and its telephone boxes were yellow. It was not far from France, but was not French. The island had its own distinctive language, but Sandra had only heard English spoken there, though in a foreign accent. Some of the street signs and house names were in English, and some were in French, or at least it looked like French. She did not, when she first holidayed there, know much French. At school, she learnt to say, "Je suis une fille unique," which sounded better than it was, and "J'ai un cochon d'Inde," which, although she did not have one. Later still, she learnt phrases from a book, "Good morning," and "Good afternoon," and "I must go now," and "Go away." She could say, "A table for one, please," and "I didn't order this," and "Can I have a refund?" She could say, "Can you help me?" and "I'm really sorry," and "I don't understand." She imagined herself stranded with these phrases, hoping she would be all right. It was from the dining room window of Lieloh's Seaview Hotel that Sandra first saw the smaller island of Lieloh, sunlit on the horizon. It looked like the dome of a sea monster's head, as if it were crouched on the seabed and might suddenly rise up. "What's that?" she asked. Her mother put down her butter knife and turned to look. She said it was only an island and that Sandra should finish her soup. "But what island is it?" asked Sandra. Her mother said it must be Lieloh and that her soup would go cold. Sandra, stirring her soup, said, "Can we go there?" Her mother said they had almost finished their holiday and that they already had plans for their remaining days, and her father added that it would not have been possible anyway, because the island was privately owned, and if she did not finish her soup, it would be taken away, and then she would be hungry. Sandra lifted a spoonful of soup towards her mouth, then lowered it to ask, "Who owns it?" Her father said Lieloh belonged to the Swansons, who were very rich. Valerie Swanson had been in films, said her mother, although she had to be in her 60s by now, and in her retirement was living on her own island in a house of her own design. And she was famous for her lavish parties, to which only artists were invited. Sandra pictured Valerie Swanson, star of the silver screen, sleek-haired, silk-gowned, standing in the doorway of her mansion, or on a patio, looking out at her extensive and immaculate garden, or on a balcony, watching the sunset as her party guests mingled. Her mother said boats were seen out there, and Sandra imagined them dotted around the island like moons around an alien planet, haunting the shore like the boats that gathered around Bridget Bardot's beach house, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. But, added her mother, looking at the undisturbed view, there didn't seem to be any there now. The closest Sandra could get to Lieloh was to walk along the seafront and down to the docks. Through binoculars, she could see trees, and she thought of the island of happiness, which no longer appeared on maps, but whose hills and woods and glimpses of chimneys and curls of smoke had been described by an antiquarian who had seen with his own eyes this island where contentment was assured. Sandra had read all about it, but could not remember where it was said to be. Somewhere beyond that barrier of greenery was the home that Valerie Swanson had built with her film star earnings. Sandra took a photograph, but when she got back to the mainland and had her pictures processed, Lieloh just looked like dark clouds on the horizon. Decades later, Sandra discovers that Lieloh has opened up as an artist's retreat, and she signs up. The idea of the pursuit of creative satisfaction runs through the novel. Sandra's mindful of her godfather, a moderately successful artist, whose creative experience seemed to consist of long periods of slogging or blockage and maddening frustration, in pursuit of brief orgasmic moments of insight or creative breakthrough, which Sandra has never had and can hardly imagine, but which he seemed to live for and which she wants. There's a reference to the French painter Millet, barely scraping a living, dedicated to making paintings that were greeted with derision and scorn. There's a reference to Van Gogh's Torment. There's a cumulative sense of this dogged pursuit of something that might remain elusive or might become unbearable. Sandra's story develops alongside a second narrative, focusing on a writer called Carol, who's been trying and failing to write a fantasy novel. He wants to write a series of them and hopes to finally manage it, secluded on an island. I'm going to read a short chapter in which she is meeting her friend for lunch before leaving. Jane is waiting for Carol in the restaurant's conservatory, where the branches of cherry blossom trees reach along the walls and across the ceiling. It is like a stage set for A Midsummer Night's Dream. It is like Max's bedroom in Where the Wild Things Are. The trees are not real, of course. The cherry blossom is not real. There is jazz playing in the background, which Carol finds soothing. She joins Jane at a table for two near the fireplace. There is a good fire going, and the warmth just about reaches them. "Look at my shoes," says Carol, showing Jane the damp calfskin, her damp tights. Jane sympathises. She has ordered wine, she says. They both know the wine here is good. If there's one thing Carol cannot bear, it is substandard wine. They browse the menu, and a waiter brings their drinks and takes their food order. Carol asks for the duck foie gras, followed by the venison. They sip their glasses of Pinot Noir, and Jane says, "So tell me your news." Carol has been putting off this moment, knowing that her friend will try to change her mind. But it's too late now. There will be no talking her out of it. "You've written your novel?" prompts Jane. No, says Carol. No, says Jane. I was joking. I'm going away for a while, says Carol. That sounds ominous, says Jane. Carol laughs. She butters her bread and says, do you remember Roman? Roman with the good looks and the private islands, says Jane, making eyes at her friend. I do indeed. That's where I'm going, says Carol. Jane is agog. You're going to stay with Roman on his private island. Roman isn't living there, says Carol. He wants to sell it, but he offered me the chance to stay in the empty house in the meantime. You mean you're going to stay there alone, says Jane. That's the idea, says Carol. It's the perfect place to try and write my novel. There'll be no distractions. No Jane, says Jane. No boozy lunches, no lost afternoons. I'll have nothing to do but write, says Carol. She expects Roman will visit her, though. She would hope to have a little bit of company from time to time. You're going to lock yourself away in a room, says Jane, and not come out until you've spun all the straw into gold. Something like that, says Carol. How long are you going for? Asks Jane. As long as it takes, says Carol. As long as it takes to sell the island, or as long as it takes to write the novel, asks Jane. Either way, says Carol. At the end of it, either I'll return with a finished novel, or I won't. You'll hate it, says Jane, as the waiter arrives with their meals. Carol smiles at her friend and picks up her cutlery. But you can always phone me, says Jane. I'll come and get you in my private helicopter. They both laugh, while the fire dances in the grate and the rain hammers down outside. So that's a bit of an introduction to the retreat and a taste of the two narratives. Thank you.
Trying to unmute myself here. Thank you, Alison. That was wonderful. And now, Venetia Welby, writer and journalist, you have lived and worked on 4 continents. Your debut novel, Mother of Darkness, was published by Quartet in 2017, and you've had essays and short fiction in various magazines, including The Spectator, The London Magazine, Review 31, and your work has appeared in anthologies including Garden Among Fires and Trauma. And indeed, some of your travel experiences in Arizona and Okinawa, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, are reflected in the novel you're launching tonight, Dreamtime. So tell us about it, and we'll have a reading from us. Over to you, Venetia.
Great, thanks very much for having me. Dreamtime is about the journey of a young American woman to find her GI father in Japan at a near future time of climate catastrophe. Sol is fresh out of Tucson Desert Rehab, where she's learnt the vital information of her father's whereabouts. And as flying's about to be banned, this is her last chance to find him. Her childhood friend Kit goes with her. He's madly in love with her, but their childhood was an unusual one, to say the least, and this has left them both with various issues. When they reach Japan, nothing is as it seems. Viria, the virtual reality device that has enabled a new level of fake news, makes sure of that. And it seems there's some deeper, trickster force at work too. Soon they're joined on their journey by Hunter, a large, much older Marine with whom Sol seems infatuated and Kit instantly dislikes. They travel with Hunter to Okinawa, a small island on which great numbers of US military bases are clustered, and they move swiftly out of their depth. The part I'm going to read is when Kit and Sol go to meet Hunter in an area of Okinawa known as the American Village, for obvious reasons. Please imagine I'm doing an American accent for the dialogue. Mine's too appalling to inflict on you. On the left, Kit sees malls, brand names, Gucci, Prada, Fendi, golf supplies and beauty salons, an American wedding shop stuffed with meringue dresses, bagels and coffee, a tattoo parlor. Here it is, small town America. He was right, they should have come straight here and asked their own questions. Now chains such as Starbucks, the ubiquitous diner A&W and McDonald's take over, with the diamond wire tessellations of Camp Leicester on the other side. There has been no break in the sea of wire for miles. Look, Sol is gesturing to a great Ferris wheel up ahead. That must be it. We are approaching your destination, says the car. You are about to enter the American Village. Get ready for a real fun time. Fun Times are sponsored by Viria, another voice interjects at terms and conditions speed. Don't forget to tag us in your holograbbies. As soon as the car opens Kit's door, he can hear strains of turn-of-the-century US music and smell a damp Christmas. Strains of wet cinnamon and allspice through the rain that is now coming down in a deluge again. There's no predicting it. Viria can't get it right anyway. They head into the complex, keeping under cover through winding red brick streets of pizzerias, burger bars, and American shops. But it's not the America Kit knows. Here there's a milkshake on every corner. At least this theme park's free from the drugs and the gangs. No sun fugitives beating down its air-conditioned doors. A wide circular shop calls to mind the Rust Belt, its orange wall reflecting the drenched terracotta paving stones. Full Christmas regalia hangs from its corroded metal balcony. Garlands of baubled fir tree shroud a Statue of Liberty shedding tears in the torrent. There's a star and stripe spangled rocket, or is it a nuke? Massive Santas, a festive snowman, and a couple of feisty gingerbread men look similarly depressed and dangerous, foregrounded by a palm tree. There is fake snow everywhere, and it forms an unpleasant brown mulch with the rainstorm. Must be plenty of homesick servicemen who buy into this shit, who have forgotten the reality of America and believe this mini version to be its quintessence. Eventually, they emerge at the bars and cafes of the sea wall, the wide sweep of Sunset Beach to their left, its waters swelling and flexing. Sol points out a hostel that might do for later. Rain drenches 100 happy hour signs along the promenade, and they take shelter in the first doorway. Their clothes and bags are already soaked, Sol fiddles with her Viria, and in a second they see Hunter swaggering up to them, unperturbed by the rain shooting off his short blonde hair. He looks broader than ever in white shorts and a dark blue sleeveless shirt. Stubble of a distinctly ginger hue has sprouted prolifically in the past 2 days. "Hey," he says, hugs Sol and shakes Kit's hand powerfully. "We're just down here. Come and join us." Hunter's grin is fully stretched, revealing his strong white teeth. Kit sees Sol slip straight into character, skipping along girlishly next to the great man, her thin arm threaded through his unbroken one. Kit falls back into file behind them, the old hierarchy instantly reasserted. The sea is lashing itself with its own tail coming up over the walkway, and Kit feels again that he is in the presence of something ancient and raw, and in no way benevolent. An eternal dragon, a kraken, a king, an army of bloodless octopodal aliens. As Kit's skin starts to tighten across him, prickling parcel wrap, Hunter leads them, dripping, into a rock bar imported straight from the US of A, where thousands of its identical siblings decorate the city streets. Replete as it is with Americans black and white, Kit now feels he could be back in Arizona. Sanitized safety, the soft metal hit from the 2 loudspeakers, electric guitars on the walls, and the coat your nostrils and lard scent of frying meat. Meat from the meat farm, from creatures genetically modified to meet demands in a world no longer conducive to the existence of sacrificial animals. Kit follows Hunter and Sol over to a pool table near the back of the bar, where the walls are lined with old American beer ads. There's a man already there, bent over the table to take one of the last remaining shots. Is Sol asking herself if this is her father? With a satisfying crack, the 8-ball slides into the pocket, and as the man straightens up, Kit can see that he is younger and slighter than Hunter, but the two look quite alike. The shorn austerity of his blonde hair makes Hunter's low fade and new stubble look decadent, though. There's a button brightness to the man's green eyes that the slackness of his mouth belies. Kit takes in the jeans, the t-shirt, displaying some esoteric album cover. "This is Finn," says Hunter. "Finn Garcia." "Hey," Finn fist bumps Sol, then Kit. "Hey," says Kit in a curt, businesslike tone. He is disappointed that all Hunter has dredged up after disappearing for 2 days is this youth. They are clearly a few Orions down already, and Kit wants to ask how long the USMC enforced the latest alcohol ban. 1 week? 2? He swallows and reminds himself that enduring Hunter is a necessary evil for bringing Sol home safely, and soon. It is at home, he realizes, not racing around out here pretending to be travelers, that he and Sol might have a chance. This time next week, when she's had time to get over the jet lag, he'll ask her out properly. Dinner and dancing in Tucson's finest. Start again and take it from there. "Want a drink?" asks Finn, sinking the black. He's buying. He grins at Hunter, then leans his cue stick against the wall. Hunter smiles ruefully. Hardly a fair game. Kit sees that he has taken his arm out of its sling in anticipation of playing another shot, but now he uses his meaty other to reinsert it. Woven among the beer signs are ads for 2-for-1 shots, red-headed sluts, pink starfuckers, and cocktails, king of which must be the mighty trash can, glowing green like it's made of plutonium and claiming to contain the whole bar. It comes with a warning, 2,500 yen puke cleanup fee. Beyond, there's a terrace wallpapered in polite notices. Dear customers, do not spit or throw anything else over the wall. Please use the garbage bins inside. Offenders will be penalised and asked to leave the premises. Thank you for your understanding, bar management. Kit sees Saul watching him and drops his eyes. I'll help you carry the drinks, he tells him. But a robot waitress with pneumatic tits is already zooming pool table side. How can I help you boys today? She asks with an improbably large baring of teeth. Same again and fewer guests? It is a matter of seconds before she zooms back with a tray of Oreos, some nuts, something unidentifiable on toast. It's happy hour. Everyone gets a free appetizer in happy hour, silly. She strokes Kit's arm lustily before whizzing back behind the bar. Sol looks daggers at him. He will never understand her, never thread his way through the psychic maze of small things that thrill her or fill her with despair. She has a language he has learned since infancy, but he'll always find the grammar fucking impenetrable. Thanks very much.
Wonderful reading. So, it was very interesting to find the cross currents between the two. They're very different books. I thoroughly enjoyed both of them. They're also beautifully produced, I thought, by Salt. They look spectacular. They're lovely. Both of you use island settings in very different ways. And can you tell us a bit about the attractions? Why an island? Will I start with you, Venetia?
I think islands are magical. I'm obsessed with them. They have a sort of, I really like the first line of Alison's book that she read about it being, Lieloh being an in-between place. I'm sure she'll tell you more about that. But so it is with Okinawa. It's its own indigenous populated island who have fought for many, many years against various invaders and colonizers, and it has elements of Japanese and elements of American culture and its own culture. It is an island is a liminal space, I think, and it also feels like a thin place, which is a concept I learnt when I was looking into things. This idea that anything can enter when the veils are thin on islands, and this sort of borderland where sea and land meet. They've often been at the mercy of larger mainlands and had to resist that, which I think makes their own culture stronger, even though it's also eroded. There's a constant tension between those. I mean, I was first drawn to Okinawa by the kind of psychic conflict of a place, the idea that it would be divided 3 ways. And it was. I mean, Okinawa is one of 160 islands, an archipelago. Some people say there are 500 islands, but there are sort of 160 that are known. And most of them are not inhabited. But for a long time, 500 years, it was its own kingdom, and very prosperous. There was a connecting trade route. They are exotic tropical islands with their own unique folklore, which is again something I'm sure we'll come on to. Like folklore on an island seems to come directly from the landscape of the island and to be inseparable from it and to be believable when you're on it. Is it time for me to tell you that what happened to Okinawa?
Can you tell us about the island as a setting, Alison?
So I think 2 elements that make islands interesting for certain stories are the physical remoteness, isolation, and the difficulty in just leaving. and the possible consequences of that, including psychological implications of isolation. And then secondly, we have in our mythology islands that have appeared on maps, that we've put on maps, but which might never have existed. And in stories set on islands, there often is this element of otherworldliness. And Venetia, I noticed we both used that same phrase, talking about an island as an in-between place. We used exactly that phrase. And I loved those crossovers. And one thing that I enjoyed doing in the retreat was kind of threading through Carol, the writer's stay on the island, with references to stories set on islands in which things take a nasty turn. So there's this sense of the fiction, this kind of wealth of fiction behind us bumping up against her reality of the novel, the reality of the novel. So in the retreat, the island is both this place Sandra dreams of, and it's also a setting where everything falls apart for her. And rather than being able to leave, she goes further into this isolating and otherworldly environment.
It does. I think it feels like islands are shrouded in secrecy as well, like a place where anything can happen and does in your islands and online.
And that magical space you talk about is the folklore and mythology underlying your texts make them so fascinating, because bits I recognized, bits I didn't know at all. Venetia, you're drawing on presumably folklore you found, the mythology that was already there?
Yes, in Japan, and particularly in Okinawa, which is not Japan, but colonized by Japan. I mean, it belongs to Japan. It's at the mercy of Japan, but it is also of itself. And it has its own folklore, shape-shifting, exciting beasts such as the Kijimuna and, kitsune on mainland Japan, shape-shifting foxes. But I also wanted to explore Western folklore, and the idea of Western folklore emerging in the wrong place. Western culture has invaded Okinawa, along with crime and pollution and a great deal of suffering. So I wanted to show the meeting of Eastern and Western folklore, particularly with regard to trickster figures. So I've always been interested in the Bluebeard myth, which I know Alison references as well, and linked to that, the sort of animal groom cycle of fairy tales, where you're getting married to a delightful young man and everything's rosy, and then at some point you see he gives himself away as animal in some way, a tail, a paw, some fur, something, and then you realize you're in mortal danger, and there's likely a sort of cellar full of former brides and their bones. So that felt like actually quite a decent metaphor for some of the things that go on in Okinawa, thanks to the US military there over the last 100 years or so.
Alison, I enjoyed the Irish references that was it Hy-Brasil, the island?
Yes.
I kept, the island of happiness. But and the way you used children's stories that have almost become folklore, like Alice in Wonderland, I thought those threadings of our culture and bleeding over into folklore were really well done in the book.
Thank you. Well, I think a key thing in relation to that sort of area, fairy tales and so on, is when Sandra's roommate says to her that fairy tales and horror stories are not necessarily different things, and Bluebeard is an example of that. So yes, there are these kind of fairy tales and those what we call children's stories, but Alice in Wonderland is actually a really weird story, isn't it? You know, there's a lot of dark stuff in there, and similarly fairy tales. So yes, it's kind of bringing the two together. So we might think of something as what we often mean by fairy tales, you know, princesses and unicorns, and children's books, the innocence that should you know be in there, but they both can kind of come together in this darker area. And I've recently been reading some stories by Angela Redman, and she does wonderful things with fairy tales, giving them a perspective or a modern context that kind of exposes how weird and dark they can be.
Wow, there's one to look for. Venetia, you're talking about the politics, and you've touched on it there, the American influence coming in. How did you balance telling the story with the politics? I mean, the politics of climate change, politics of the military.
Well, with difficulty, basically, and the next book I'm planning an entirely fictional setting where I can't get anything wrong. I don't have to consult anyone. I just read Piranesi by sorry. Thank you. Yes, exactly. And I heard her saying a similar thing, but decided to go for that because it required no external research, and she'd obviously done a lot before. It'd be really nice not to have to constantly fact check stuff. But obviously it was the reality of the political situation in Okinawa that drew me to the book itself. And that's where I went first. And what I found is that I put far too much factual stuff in. Like when I was writing the book, I was very worried about leaving anything out. And as a result, I sacrificed the actual story to the kind of like cannot be found wanting for any detail whatsoever. Which I suppose is natural when you're sort of dealing with a setting that's not natural to you, and you feel like you have to explain it to other people who haven't been there or seen it either. Future drafts were mainly about sort of whittling out all the research I'd done and sort of coming to understand, because it's my first time doing something like this, coming to understand that you have to know the research to make something convincing, to make it feel true, to make it say something real. But the story has to come first. And I don't know, the research I did, I could have channeled it into a factual book, but I don't really, I being tethered to fact worries me because of the fear of getting it wrong, not doing it justice. And I feel like a novel can give something different, the interiority of the situation, the feeling of it, the spiritual aspect. So I suppose I expanded on to try and get away from fact while basing it on the facts of things that have actually happened or are happening right now, by putting in the future, which gave me some leeway with, what can actually potentially happen, and also the mythological underpinnings and the wholly imaginary characters.
Talking of facts, I mean, it struck me, Alison, that so much of your narrative, like dealing with isolation and chosen or otherwise, and then people being thrown together in groups they might not necessarily want to be in, or, the choice we have over groups and isolation is reflecting stuff that went on during lockdown. How much of the story of those elements of the story came before lockdown, or were you writing it during lockdown, or which way did it happen?
I was actually really, really lucky that just by chance, because obviously, you know, when the pandemic kind of was coming, it seemed to happen quite suddenly. So I wasn't trying to work around it in advance, but I just happened to have finished the first drafts at the point at which I would send it out to my agent and editor, just a few weeks before homeschooling started. And I really couldn't have been writing during that time, partly because I wanted to focus on that, you know, because that's important, and the writing can wait. But I'd got that to a point where I could just leave it, because equally, if I was halfway through it and then left it, it can be really hard to come back, and the same energy's there. So yes, so I'd got the story largely written, apart from endless editing and tweaking, before lockdown. So it wasn't about that. It wasn't a response to lockdown. But I think I do like taking my characters out of their comfort zones, which is the same thing as taking myself out of my comfort zone and sort of seeing what happens. I find that interesting in a story. And in the case of the retreat, with this situation, this group, you know, she doesn't quite belong, and she's trying to sort of access something, and she can't. So that sort of echoes her artistic ambition, where she's just not quite able to make it work.
Yeah, it's very interesting on this artistic creative process. Your story, Venetia, I think because of lockdown, I've noticed I'm reading narratives differently. Like, it's almost like narratives seem prescient, that it came out a few years and everybody's talking about germs, and but I mean, you're directly talking about the fact that flying might have to stop, Venetia, and the climate change. I mean, it is climate change fiction. Can you tell us a bit about weaving that narrative into the story?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was quite confused by people describing it as climate change fiction. I always thought of it as literary fiction, with maybe a speculative element or two threaded through it. And because I feel reading literary fiction that it should include more climate change, given how incredibly prevalent it is. And as I was writing about an island, I don't think you can ever consider an island without, particularly an island in the Pacific, without that being the backdrop. So yeah, I consider climate change the backdrop. And the end of flying sounds great, but it's not a particularly positive thing in the novel. It's an attempt by nationalistic governments to halt movement so they can hang on to the land that is still good, that is not being reclaimed by the sea, so that they can not be responsible for the droves of climate refugees knocking at the doors. And some fairly sinister things happen or are happening as a result of this mentality. It's very much sort of America first. The billionaires are decamping to their estates in New Zealand, and
will control travel. I mean, I didn't mean it as dismissive. I mean, any kind of genres, I think, are always blurred. I don't think, it's just that it seems people have come up with this label, and maybe I got over fixated on putting it in. I didn't mean to put it in a genre, but I thought it addresses climate change fiction. Sorry, it addresses climate change really interestingly in its story without being overtaken by it. We've got some questions coming in.
And it's really nice.
Kerry. Kerry says islands are great places to set unsettling fiction. They're separate places. And she says she loves the voices of both these novels. I'm saying she here, might be he. I notice you use the present tense in these novels. Was there a reason for this? Did it flow naturally? If I go to you, Alison, first about the present tense.
Yes. So the retreat does start with a prologue, which is set in the past tense, and that's when Sandra's a child. And then, yes, we leap ahead about 30 years or so, and then that's all in the present tense. And sometimes it just feels right to use a particular tense, and I think what the present tense can do, especially in unsettling fiction, is just keep you kind of right there on the edge as it's happening. So it's not something that's done and dusted and you're looking back on an account of it. It's there is that sort of feeling of being right in the moment. It's an interesting exercise for a writer actually to switch that and see what difference that makes. But that felt right for this novel.
Venetia?
Yeah,
Your use of the tense.
I think this is something you do really well, Alison, to blurring the timelines as well. Like everything is immediate, and it took me a while to realise, what was happening when, and it was done in a really subtle and brilliant way, I thought. I like writing in the present tense in general. It feels natural to me, but in this particular instance, I feel like my characters are sort of wading through fog, and they can only see, they can barely see their hand in front of them. Nothing is as it seems. They're sort of literally trying to work out where they are in that exact moment, and I think it contributes to that sense. But I also intersperse between chapters an older Ryukyuan woman who's talking about her life over the past 70 years since the American occupation, since the American bases stayed, even though Okinawa was handed back to Japan. That is in the past, which I like to think gives a sense of the past living in the present. Okinawa feels a place like that where the history doesn't die. It's not past. The ghosts of the past are in the present. The history is like a sort of terrible cycle that won't end. It's a place that is stuck, and I think the tense reflects that.
I thought those bits worked really well. I really liked that narrative thread going through it. Jason has a question for Alison. A sense of inevitable fate seems to run through your novels. Is there something about people being drawn along a path that interests you?
Yes, that is a good question, because I was aware, kind of as I kind of two or three novels in, certainly after my first couple of novels, I did become aware that I sort of started a crossroad in somebody's life where they're going to make a change in their life. Just circumstances kind of demand it. Someone kind of arrives in their life, or there's something that forces a change in their life. And for me, it's a more interesting story to explore. Is if it's going to get a bit weird and dark and unsettling, I just find that more interesting to write. And then in terms of the sense of fate, I suppose it's interesting because I don't plan in advance. I'll start with a character, a situation, kind of a feel of something, maybe themes, something I want to explore, and then I just kind of go on the journey with the character, seeing how it unfolds, which I suppose, given that, yes, I agree. In fact, there was a review today that talked about how you end up kind of tangled up in the web, such that there's really no escape, which might seem like something that you've planned out if everything's kind of pointing there. And I suppose what it is that as I start and have a sense of what the situation is, so say in this case with Sandra, this inability to achieve what she wants to achieve, but still persevering, pushing on, even it feels like she's kind of always going the wrong way. She's kind of going, as she tries to move towards what she wants, she's actually moving further away from the real world and the people who love her. So that just kind of thematically is going to force her into a corner, really, and then the island settings come into it as well, and yeah, she ends up, well, actually no, I'll give the give the ending away, but yeah, there's that sense of it kind of always pushing towards a predetermined conclusion, I think.
You get a bit of that in Venetia as well, that it's a quest, if you like. She's looking for something desperately, but it's almost like, can you ever really find it? If you're bringing your own problems with you, you think one thing is going to fix that. And that the quest, or the element of searching, I think, is very interesting. And
I think there's a great deal of circularity in Sol's quest and in Okinawa's quest to break free. The forces of trauma at the beginning are so strong that controls what it is that you're seeking and the way that you seek it, and almost makes it inevitable that you arrive at something you already know. More so in the personal case of Sol, who's desperately trying to escape addiction and feels that finding this father who abandoned her is the way out, but in fact it's just the way in to further complications and further danger and further risk-taking behavior, which is slightly different to the protests in Okinawa, where the forces of oppression are simply too great for voices to make it outside them. They're ringed by more powerful voices, and in Dreamtime those voices are made even more powerful by this virtual reality device, which is pretty much like Fox News. Like, the same people who own Viria control the news. It allows the American narrative to be perpetuated, and when greater forces such as saber rattling between China and the US, or greater forces such as climate change occur, then they can be used in a world where you can't ever see the truth. They can be used as a shield for terrible things.
The reader saying they're reading The Retreat and loving it, so no spoilers, please. Your question to Alison: were you worried about writing about artists and writers? It seems to be one of those topics that some editors and publishers shy away from. As they say, not many readers are interested in that topic.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting, because I wasn't aware of that. And actually, sometimes I think it's really helpful to not be too aware of these things you should and shouldn't do, because it can end up limiting you, make you self-conscious about what you're doing. So no, I wasn't nervous about that. I suppose the only thing I was nervous about is that there's deliberately a lot of negativity and hostility bouncing around the group. And I certainly wouldn't want to make it look like I thought writers or artists were like this. You know, the group is designed as it is for very specific reasons, and not because that's how I think writers and artists would be. And in fact, the retreats I've been on, writing retreats, but also art classes and so on, have all been so friendly and so welcoming and so supportive. But in the retreat, that's not, I'm not writing about what that kind of experience would really be like. It's purely serving as something that she wants and cannot access. So it's designed that particular way.
So you won't be banned forever from the Arvon courses or anything. There's a very interesting analogy between the toxins that Sol is cleaning from her body and the military toxins of colonization and, well, I'm back with climate change again, but I thought those kind of personal damage, trauma, as you mentioned earlier, that you carry with you, because the same thing has happened to the country, to the island, that writing about trauma. How do you do that?
I think that's really perceptive, and I suppose I see the links as a lack of stewardship, a lack of guardianship. Sol was abandoned by her father, and this makes her vulnerable to her horrific stepfather, foster father. Foster fathers come in when there's no real caring parenting going on, and so the door is open for abuse. And you could say the same thing about Okinawa. Japan took it on. It colonized it. It was essentially its parent, but it used it as a human shield in World War II. Lost most of the island's population, allowed the American bases to stay even beyond when the Americans actually physically departed. And so I see America as that foster father that was allowed to come in and abuse because of the abrogation of responsibility of the real parental figure. And then I suppose you could see the same thing happening with the world and the animals of the world, particularly. Humans are meant to steward and guard and cultivate and parent. And in fact, that abrogation of responsibility has allowed the big oil companies to be in charge. They are the evil foster parents doing damage and allowed to do damage because we look away, because we don't quite understand. We don't really understand the urgency. And also I think because our brains are, programmed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And it's incredibly painful and distressing kind of seeing constant statistics of our own imminent demise. It's like trying to understand your own death is hard enough, but trying to understand the death of the species, the entire known world is that on a grand scale.
I'm thinking about your book against the current news reports. I found that you start putting it in a political context. We're almost out of time. Thank you very much, both of you. If you have anything to plug or any web pages you'd like to tell us about, new blogs or anything, what's happening next? Alison, what are you up to next?
I am currently working on a short story. I don't think I can say who it's for because they've not announced it, but it's a commission. Really, really pleased to be a part of it. It's an interesting project and a fun story to write. So I'm working on that at the moment.
What are you up to? It's a terrible question to ask somebody who's only just launched a book. It takes so long for books to come out. What are you up to, Venetia?
Well, I'm sort of thickly in the promotional activity stages, and writing articles about Okinawa and delivering excerpts and doing reading at Brixton Book Jam next week, which might be quite fun. But yeah, on the back burner, I have this idea of a fictional island, but I don't want Alison to
Islands have been so productive because I started thinking about all the children's stories that are set in islands as well. And, for adults and children, I think they've been great. But it's lovely to meet you both and the best of luck with your books. They're great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody who attended. Thank you, Five Leaves, for hosting. And thank you, Simon, for your technical expertise. And of course, to Salt for bringing us these wonderful books in the first place. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much.